Captain Stanley O'Kelly, the pilot of the RB-50G known as Little Red Ass, knew he was playing a dangerous game. He steered his lumbering aircraft along the perimeter of Soviet airspace near Vladivostok, weaving as far across the invisible border as he dared before turning back. In the back, a team of electronic signals intelligence professionals tended their dials and oscilloscopes, trying to glean what they could about the Soviets' radar line. In wartime, that information could be the difference between the desired apocalypse and a disastrous failure. At 6:15 a.m. local time, Captain O'Kelly decided to call it a day. He turned back for Yokota. Moments later, the MiGs attacked. Cannon fire disabled the RB-50G's number 1 engine and set the number 4 on fire. The attack also tore off part of the tail section and damaged the wing. The tail gunner, James E. Woods, got off a short burst and scored hits on one of the silvery aircraft as it flashed by. Captain O'Kelly put his aircraft into a steep dive in an attempt to evade the MiGs, whereupon the damaged wing gave way, and less than 2 minutes later the RB-50 crashed into the sea, killing 16 of the 17 crew aboard. Because of the secret nature of Little Red Ass's mission and suspicion that it had been shot down over international waters, the exact circumstances of its destruction were buried for 40 years. But in the Soviet Union, they knew that the MiG-17 had been blooded for the first time. Remarkably, it will be 25 years until the aircraft that NATO referred to as the Fresco would score its last kill. In between times, it would down examples of 3 generations of Western fighters, but somehow failed to cement its status as one of the most effective combat aircraft of the Cold War. And this is despite the MiG-17 essentially being a 1940s fighter. Migoyan and Gurovich's OKB-155 began to develop a further upgraded version of the MiG-15 bis in late 1948. This was 2 years before the faggot's dramatic introduction in the Korean War, and runs counter to any narrative that its development was in response to the MiG-15's success. Like any self-respecting aircraft designer, Mikoyan was only really interested in the next thing. By early 1949, the Politburo had got wind of OKB-155's ideas and issued formal instructions to develop 2 versions of the upgraded MiG-15, a day fighter and a radar-equipped night fighter. This video concentrates on the day fighter, as I've covered the night fighter before. Stalin himself was apparently a fan of the MiG-15. He was also a fan of Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management and preferred to iterate on an empirically proven design rather than start from scratch. More radical follow-on fighter proposals from other designers were therefore rejected. The MiG-15 was judged to have excellent climb rate, acceleration, service ceiling, and firepower. Where it fell short was principally in how it behaved as the pilot pushed it close to Mach 1. Common to other early fighters, it suffered compressibility issues that could cause sudden and violent departure from controlled flight. The main focus of effort for an upgraded MiG-15 was therefore the wing. Sagi had already published a wealth of material, much of it captured from the Germans, that related to the aerodynamic performance of a 45-degree swept wing. In fact, one of these had been fitted to a Lavochkin research aircraft called the La-176. This had been the first Soviet aircraft to break the sound barrier on the 26th of December 1948. MiG therefore set about mating the fuselage, tail and engine of a MiG-15 bis to a new wing that was swept back 45 degrees rather than 35. The project was imaginatively dubbed MiG-15 bis 45. I've made these simple comparison pictures to show the differences between a MiG-15 bis and a MiG-17. The wing was not a single angle. It's actually a sort of scimitar shape with a 45-degree sweep on the inboard half and then a 42-degree sweep outboard. The leading edges swept 49 degrees and 45 degrees at the same points. The shape was a result of wanting to retain aerodynamic balance and to ensure that the wing could fit onto the MiG-15's existing structural mounting points. The aerofoils themselves were a specification provided to MiG by Sagi for the project. They're mounted at a 3-degree anhedral rather than the 2-degree of the MiG-15. The wing tips are more rounded than on the MiG-15, and there are additional boundary layer fences on the inner section of the wings to disrupt spanwise flow. The additional pair of fences, for a total of 6, is the easiest way to tell a MiG-17 from a MiG-15 at a glance. Although they are thinner, the wings were also made more robustly than those of the Faggot, which suffered from stability issues at higher speeds due to slight differences between the torsional strength of wing pairs when they were manufactured. If you peeled back the wing of a MiG-17, you'd find the V95 aluminium alloy skin to be thicker. It was a tough aircraft that was rated to 8G. Alongside the aerodynamic and stability advantages, the new wings increased area from 221.5 feet to 243 feet. The wing hardpoints were rated for up to 250 kilograms of bombs for strike missions. Because the wings were thinner, the leading edge fairing is sharper at the fuselage joint than that of the MiG-15. The sweep of the horizontal tail was also increased from 40 degrees to 45 degrees to match that of the wings. The vertical tail grew in size by just under 3 square feet to 45.8. In the prototype, a very small ventral fin and tail bumper were added to improve directional stability. The MiG-15 has its tail bumper on the underside of the rear fuselage. No major changes were made to control systems. The surfaces were rod actuated and the ailerons were hydraulically powered. There's no redundancy in the system and the tail was still unpowered. Total fuel capacity was 373 gallons, held in 2 rubber fuel cells in the fuselage. Greater weight meant that the range was 20 miles less than the MiG-15 bis. Armament was to be the same as the late MiG-15 bis, an N-37 cannon with 40 rounds and 2 NR-23s with 80 each were both held in the same innovative droppable tray as that of the MiG-15. These were the highest velocity and highest fire rate versions of these weapons, and they remained a hard-hitting battery right to the end of the Fresco's service life. The MiG-17's main mission was to destroy US bombers, so the weaknesses of the armament set up in an engagement with other fighters was accepted. And besides, Soviet tactics remained what they'd been in the Great Patriotic War: take them by surprise, get in close, get out of Dodge City, or whatever the Soviet equivalent was. In early 1949, MiG's in-house engineering shop began work on 2 day fighter prototypes and a single radar-equipped night fighter. The first day fighter emerged from the shop in July, but it took several months to apply the finishing touches and get the aircraft ready for flight. It was finally ready in December, and it was shipped to the Zhukovsky test site. Hero of the Soviet Union, I.T. Ivashenko, who had been heavily involved in the development of the MiG-15, was assigned to perform the first flight. Unfortunately, as the VK-1 engine was run up, it failed. Examination showed that it was defective and needed to be replaced, a process that took until January 1950. Ivashenko therefore had to wait until the 14th of January to roll down the runway and lift off in the MiG-15 bis-45. His initial report showed that the new aircraft was 22 knots faster than the MiG-15 bis, with more to go if drag on the quite rough prototype could be eliminated. On the 1st of February, the prototype achieved Mach 1 in a shallow dive, a feat that was beyond the regular MiG-15 bis unless the pilot had a death wish. Aerobatics were the final element of MiG's trials, immediately prior to handing it over for state trials. Although that might seem like a relatively benign thing to do, in 1950 swept-wing jet aerobatics were a largely unexplored and therefore rather dangerous activity. And on the 17th of March, Ivashenko took off for another flight. He completed the day's program and began the descent towards Zhukovsky. At 16,000 feet, he reported that everything was normal. Then his aircraft abruptly entered a steep dive and crashed, killing him. The death of the pilot was one thing, but the suddenness and severity of the crash meant that there was no clue as to what had happened. All that was known was that the vertical tail had disintegrated in flight while travelling between 550 and 560 knots, but whether it was a manufacturing fault or something more serious was unknown. Fortunately, a second prototype had just been delivered, as had a new test pilot, Georgy Sidov. The final test program was therefore able to continue. Sometime later, Sedov was descending at 540 knots when severe tailplane flutter suddenly developed. He immediately throttled back and pulled back on the stick to stop the vibration, but he was too late. The elevators failed and the outer ends were torn clean off, leaving only 40% of the surface remaining. Sedov managed to land using engine power to control his descent rate. It was a repeat of the torsional stiffness issues that were already apparent on the regular MiG-15. The prototype thus went back into the shop for strengthening modifications emerging in the spring of 1951. Amongst those modifications was the fitment of anti-flutter weights under the wingtips. These were never fitted to the MiG-15 and they're another giveaway of a MiG-17. At around the same time, construction started on the first two pre-production examples of the MiG-15 BIS-45. State trials began in April 1951, concluding in October. They were a great success. The MiG-15 BIS-45 was 30 knots faster than the regular MiG-15 BIS. Its Mach limit was raised from 0.92 to 1.08 Mach, and the climb to 10,000 meters, 33,000 feet in old money, was reduced by 30 seconds. Remember, this is still using the same engine at this stage. Some MiG-15 problems did remain. Insufficiently rigid cannon mounts meant that gunnery accuracy with the 23mm cannons was pretty poor. Even so, the new aircraft was very impressive and it was ordered into production. Somewhere along the way, it was decided that the new aircraft was sufficiently different from a MiG-15 to justify a new designation. It thus became the MiG-17. The first orders for the MiG-17 came before trials had actually concluded. Orders to 5 factories were issued in September 1951. All of them had previously built MiG-15s, reducing the retooling required. Service trials were concluded in the Crimea, on the Black Sea, and Ukraine. It's worth saying that although it had a new designation, the MiG-17 was regarded as an interim fighter to fill the gap until truly supersonic fighters arrived in the middle 1950s. 7,999 of them were constructed in Soviet factories, plus 997 in Polish and Czech factories and 1,828 in China. Early production MiG-17s weighed 8,377 pounds with a maximum takeoff weight of 13,381. Initially powered by a 5,925 pound force VK1 turbojet, maximum speed was 591 knots. It climbed to 33,000 feet in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It's worth noting that later aircraft off the production line had the improved VK1A, which gave the same power but was more reliable. Range was 800 miles on internal fuel, which could be increased to 1,280 when carrying a pair of 88-gallon drop tanks. These were initially the same slipper tank as fitted to the early MiG-15, but soon switched over to the more conventional type with more reliable separation behavior. It was an enjoyable airplane to fly, although pilots converting from the Faggot had to get used to the larger control inputs required on the Fresco. It was a more stable and predictable aircraft at the edges of its envelope than the MiG-15 was, the result of the strengthening and overall refinements. High-altitude turning performance was notably better than its predecessor, although at this stage the overall performance difference was fairly small. An extra safety belt was added shortly after service introduction to hold pilots in their seat more firmly during high-G turns. A second ejection handle was also fitted on the left side of the seat to make it easier for pilots to get out in a hurry. In 1953, the original ejection seat was replaced by one that could be used at high transonic or supersonic speeds. It featured a retractable visor to protect the pilot's face, leg restraints to prevent injury, and stabilizers that prevented the seat from tumbling. You can tell this seat from the original by the higher back. Although MiG experimented with a blown canopy without the pronounced frames present on the MiG-15, this was assessed to be too expensive by the Ministry of Aircraft Production. A rear-view periscope was fitted instead, starting on the later production examples of the Fresco A. In order to provide additional situational awareness, the Sirena 2 tail warning system was added to detect enemy gun ranging radars. The MiG-17's excellent basic architecture made it a good candidate for an upgraded version. This made use of experiments to fit the VK1 with a simple single-stage afterburner, which had begun in 1949. The modification consisted of a short afterburner unit and a basic 2-position nozzle, all cooled by air bled from the intake duct. While the system was being developed, the VK1A replaced the VK1 on the production line, and it was therefore the test subject for the modification, resulting in the VK1F, which completed bench tests in the summer of 1951 while the state trials on the original MiG-17 were being completed. On the test bench, the new engine gave a slightly reduced 5,732 pounds of force dry, but with the upside of 7,451 pounds with the afterburner on. 25% more power was definitely worth having. The afterburner was, however, not initially intended for use during takeoff. Rather, it was to be used above 10,000 feet to improve acceleration and climbing. This engine was then fitted to a development aircraft, which was made by bolting the front of a new MiG-15 BIS to various MiG-17 parts, including, of course, the wings. The rear fuselage was new, as was the fuel system, which needed to be able to supply a lot more fuel when the afterburner was ignited. The new aft fuselage is the distinguishing feature of what would eventually become the MiG-17F. As with the prominent tailpipe, the curved section of the lower fuselage is extended. This change meant reducing the position and length of the air brakes and thus their area. Trials at MiG began in September 1951 and it was handed over for state trials in January 1952. It was immediately able to demonstrate its ability to break through the sound barrier in a shallow dive. But straight line performance was actually little improved on the regular MiG-17. Aerodynamics was still a limiting factor, as they were on many contemporary projects all around the world. The MiG-17's behaviour at the Mach was also slightly odd. It would accelerate smoothly to Mach 0.98 and then the nose would abruptly pop up and the fighter would begin to climb, however much the pilot was pushing forward on the stick. But in a steep dive, the afterburner-equipped aircraft could get up to Mach 1.25. Acceleration, on the other hand, was much better. Climbing speed more than doubled from just under 4,000 feet per minute in military power to over 8,800 with the afterburner. Service ceiling was improved, and most importantly, so was the pilot's ability to use vertical maneuvers in a dogfight. Tuning the system to cure issues where the burner would come on uncommanded or set fire to the rear fuselage took a whole year. These problems severely damaged the first prototype, and a second had to be built, this time from a production MiG-17 fresh off the line. The final version of the aircraft therefore reached state trials only in September 1952. It was good enough that it too was ordered into production, with the first aircraft joining frontline squadrons at the end of 52 and becoming operational in 1953. Operational squadrons quickly identified that the smaller air brakes on this version were inadequate. They were replaced with 50% larger pentagonal units equipped with beefier actuators. The production MiG-17F, or Fresco C to NATO, could hit 619 knots in level flight. It weighed about 200 pounds more than the Fresco A, but was dimensionally identical. Armament was basically the same, although late production Fresco Cs could carry rockets rather than bombs on their underwing hardpoints if required. These later models also had a cooling function in their air conditioning system, using an engine-driven turbine, which was a first in a Soviet fighter. Another big change in the late Fresco A and the Fresco C was the radar ranging gun sight. This was certainly inspired by the AN/APG-30, which had been obtained from a crashed Sabre in Korea. The aircraft with the ranging radar have a smaller servicing panel on the nose. Interestingly, the MiG-17F was in Soviet service during the last year of the Korean War, despite arguably being superior to any of the F-86F versions of the Sabre. Stalin personally vetoed its deployment to the combat zone. Although there were many test versions of improved MiG-17s, apart from the night fighters, there were no further versions put into production in the Soviet Union. The MiG-19 took its first flight in 1952 and entered service in 1955. For the Soviets at least, the Fresco was an interim. It served in the front line for 6 to 8 years. Even so, the sheer number of aircraft manufactured meant that many pilots were trained to fly it. Because there was no two-seat version of the Fresco, UTI MiG-15s were used for basic conversion onto the type before solo flights were allowed. By January 1955, Frontal Aviation alone were operating 2,150 MiG-17s. The PVO were operating them too, so there were likely over 3,000 Frescos in service by this point. MiG-17s were therefore frequently scrambled to investigate radar contacts during the 1950s. The Soviet Union was struggling to produce purpose-built interceptors, and the Fresco was both plentiful and widely deployed along the Soviet periphery. After the shooting down of Little Red Ass, most of the action for several years involved chasing balloons, which drifted along at altitudes above 30,000 feet. When they could be caught, a few cannon shells usually did the trick. Some heavier than air overflights were also intercepted, though. On the 8th of May 1954, an RB 47E at high altitude over the Barents Sea was surprised and attacked by Frescos. The pilot apparently believed that he was flying too high and too fast to be got at by MiG 15s. The 17, however, could get to him, although the converted bomber managed to escape with damage to its port wing and fuselage. The US Navy P 2V was less lucky that September. On the 4th of September, it was shot down near Natkodka in the Soviet Far East. The pilot was forced to ditch, and sadly, one of his crew died before they were rescued by an SA 16. U-2s appeared in Soviet skies from 1956, and they proved much harder to intercept. U-2 flights of the time would usually be accompanied by a sad tale of MiGs trying to climb up to sufficient height and then falling back away like aluminium chaff in the Dragon Lady's wake. The most infamous incident involving US spy planes and MiG-17s occurred on September 2nd, 1958, when a C-130 Hercules on an intelligence gathering mission based out of Incirlik strayed over the Soviet border due to a navigation error. It was set upon by MiG-17s almost immediately, which shot it down without challenge. 17 US service personnel were killed. Soon after, MiG-19s began to appear in numbers, and the MiG-17's role as an interceptor diminished in importance. It was, however, flown by Warsaw Pact countries as a fighter for another 10 years, before being relegated to close air support as MiG-21s entered widespread service. The next country to take the Fresco into combat was Communist China. Counting both Soviet and domestically built aircraft, the PLA had 20 regiments of MiG-17s, and they used them extensively in their constant scraps with Taiwan. Their first kill was made on the 22nd of June 1955 when a reconnaissance-configured RT-33 was shot down over Jiangxi, killing the pilot. Statistics thereafter are the usual mix of hope, cope, and facts. Incidents involving heavy aircraft are easier to catalogue, and the consequences of these engagements are broadly agreed on by both sides. Between 1955 and 66, Chinese MiG-17s and J-5s shot down 2 B-17s, 2 Neptunes, an HU-16 Albatross, and an RB-57 Canberra. Rumours that they destroyed a U-2 that had suffered mechanical issues during 1958 appear to be baseless. Fighter-on-fighter engagements are more controversial, with both sides claiming many victories that aren't borne out by the available facts. The ROCAF was initially equipped with F-86 Sabres and F-84 Thunderjets as fighters. Taiwan admits to 2 F-84s and 3 F-86s being lost to Frescos, all in 1958. China claims 16 Sabres shot down in this period. On the other side, Taiwanese pilots claimed at least 36 MiG-17s destroyed, all but 2 of these by Sabres. China admits to 3 losses, which feels quite light. MiG-17s were, after all, the first victims of the AIM-9 Sidewinder on the 24th of September 1958. The one that came back with an AIM-9B embedded in it enabled the Soviet Union to develop the atoll. The exact truth will have to wait for the fall of Chinese communism. The overclaim rate is typically 3 times reality. Applying that basic rule of thumb would give us 5 Sabres exchanged for 12 Frescos, but I wouldn't stand behind those numbers. Next, to use the MiG-17 in combat were the Egyptians, who fielded a small number alongside their MiG-15s during the Suez Crisis, some likely flown by Soviet aviators. 1 aircraft was lost to a Mystère 4. Over the next 20 years, the IDF would claim 61 MiG-17s shot down. Actually confirming that is, of course, quite hard, but it isn't an unrealistic number given the hundreds of MiG-17s supplied to the Arab states by the Soviet Union. Of the claimed losses, 18 were shot down during the Six-Day War, as well as 35 more destroyed on the ground. 13 further aircraft were claimed during the 1973 war, but of these, 7 were supposedly downed in a single engagement at Afira, the veracity of which I've investigated before. The biggest Israeli killer of Frescos were Mirages. Including the few downed by Neshas, 47 were destroyed by them. Phantoms apparently only got the 7 claimed at Afira. Taking out the obviously spurious leads to somewhere around 55 MiG-17s shot down by the Israelis, which is a surprisingly modest total. Fresco pilots did quite poorly in return. They shot down 5 Israeli jets during the Six-Day War and 4 during 1973 for a total of around 9. Their poor showing had much to do with the role in which the Frescos were employed. As fighter bombers, they were often bounced by the Israeli pilots and shot down before they could defend themselves. Less experienced pilots also flew the MiG-17. Over Vietnam, the type would do much better in its favoured role. The first Vietnamese pilots to get their hands on a MiG-17 did so in 1960. Having completed their basic training on Yak-18s in China, they then began the process of converting to the Fresco. Training took place in China and the Soviet Union, and it was completed by 1962. To celebrate this achievement, the Soviets gifted North Vietnam 36 Fresco A's and some UTI MiG-15 trainers, enabling them to establish the 921st Fighter Regiment on August 6, 1964. Although they now had some pilots, they still had nowhere near enough. Flying Soviet fighters was physically demanding, and there was no infrastructure of flight schools in place to prepare potential pilots in Vietnam. The dropout rate for Vietnamese pilots was therefore very high. Only 20% graduated Soviet courses versus 90% of Warsaw Pact aviators. The latter were very disparaging about the Vietnamese cadets, although there's doubtless a slice of racism in their views. According to their accounts, every time 5 cadets went up, a dozen Soviet pilots would have to sortie to round them up and bring them home. Twice as many hours were required to get a Vietnamese pilot ready for his first solo. Those that made it through would take their 150 hours of MiG experience back into an environment in which extended training in their squadrons was next to impossible. If MiGs flew, they were targets for US aviators desperate to notch a kill. The Vietnamese pilots had no training in combat tactics to fall back on, and for the most part would prove to be brave but fatally naive opponents when they encountered serious opposition. A minority of pilots did, however, really make the Fresco work. Of course, there's been endless books and shows about the MiG-17 in Vietnam. One of the lazy tropes that I've fallen into myself in the past is to suggest that its capabilities were a surprise or a shock to US aviators. That makes for a great video title, but it's patently false. The Fresco had been known to the West since well before its combat debut in 1953. Numerous examples had then been shot down and had retaliated against sabres in the Taiwan Straits. They'd been engaged by Mystères over Egypt, and of course, the closely related MiG-15 was the antagonist of thousands of Korean War engagements. The US had even flown an admittedly knackered MiG-15 bis in Operation Moolah. To add to this, any F-100 pilot who had served in Europe knew that Canadair's Sabres, and to a lesser extent Super Mystères, were to be avoided unless they could be surprised with a single high-speed pass. Before the war even started properly, Project Feather Duster pitted the porky F-86H Saberhawk against the latest US tactical fighters and demonstrated once again that if a pilot got into a roller with a first-generation fighter below 450 knots, then he was going to be in trouble. So the MiG-17 wasn't a surprise, and its pilots weren't really the best. It was effective because Vietnamese GCI and pilot discipline was far better than expected. More significantly, US commanders overestimated the effectiveness of their radars and missiles, and their pilots were untrained in air-to-air combat and overconfident about their abilities. Eventual testing of the HAV drill and HAV ferry MiG-17s captured by the Israelis confirmed that the combination of a low wing loading and 8G structural limit made the Fresco dangerous at low altitudes, where its pilots could also reduce the effectiveness of the Sparrow and Sidewinder. The MiG pilots exploited this by orbiting in a Luftwaffe circle at low altitude, which was hard for the gunless USAF fighters to break into. Operating close to their bases, the MiGs were fulfilling their designed role of point defense, whereas the US fighters had to fly significant distances to engage them. Purity of purpose allowed such a modest aircraft to be a danger. And these tactical advantages were in many ways the essence of the danger posed by the Fresco. It wasn't a surprise superfighter. It retained the MiG-15's challenging handling characteristics above 450 knots indicated airspeed or 0.85 Mach. Poor stability in yaw made it difficult to control in most flight modes. Its hard-hitting cannon armament was only really useful at very close ranges, exacerbated by a poor gun sight that took 2 or 3 seconds to establish a lead pipper and even then wasn't accurate. The Soviets had experimented with replacing the 23mm and 37mm combination with a pair of 30mm cannons, but the cost wasn't worth the limited benefits in upgrading an obsolete platform. The pilot strain VPAF pilots experienced in training was also a feature of the MiG-17 in combat. It retained the MiG-15's heavy, unassisted controls, unintuitive cockpit layout, and poor visibility. A clear canopy had been considered, but was regarded as an unnecessary expense. The rear-view periscope that was fitted instead just wasn't as good. The controls were in fact so heavy that some Vietnamese pilots, being slighter than the average Russian or Eastern European, struggled to fully maneuver the aircraft in long engagements. Bigger pilots had their own issues too. The cockpit was very cramped and the seat was tight. Anyone over 6 feet tall was quite discomforted. And yet, in the final reckoning, MiG-17s downed at least 28 US tactical fighters during the Vietnam War, the last in 1972. 11 of these were F-4s, 3 were Crusaders, and 8 were F-105s. The balance of 6 were a range of types consisting of 3 Sky Raiders, a Skyhawk, a C-47, and a Sky Warrior, bounced by Chinese MiGs. VPAF pilots, by the way, claimed a total of 143 kills. In exchange, 61 MiG-17s were shot down by US tactical fighters and another 14 were lost to other causes, mainly their own SAMs and AAA. That's a roughly 2.2 to 1 kill ratio in favour of the US aviators. The relative simplicity of the Fresco made it enduringly popular in the air forces of nations without the resources to operate complicated third-generation fighters, or the relationship with the US to access MAP. The last recorded kill by the type was in 1977, when a Somali MiG-17 shot down an Ethiopian C-47, but Frescos were still serving in numerous African militaries into the 1990s. Over 100 aircraft remain in service with North Korea. Multiple examples came to the US, the first being the 2 captured Syrian examples in 1968, followed by a Cuban aircraft whose pilot defected in 1969, and then a pair of Indonesian Lim 5s in the early 1970s. It's also possible that Moroccan and Algerian aircraft ended up at Groom Lake over the years. The MiG-17 is in some ways easy to summarize, and in some ways it's quite hard to summarize. After their original swept-wing fighters, all other aircraft-developing countries went back to the drawing board to develop supersonic successors. The Soviets did this as well, with the MiG-19, 21, the Sukhoi 7 and 9 all emerging before the end of the 1950s. But then the Soviets also produced thousands of MiG-17s, which doesn't fit the pattern. Its only analogue is the F-86H Sabre Hog, but the Hog was intended to fill a gap in tactical nuclear weapons delivery coverage rather than play the same air superiority role as the original Sabre. France's Super Mystère was developed more as an industrial fillip than a realistic tactical fighter, although it would prove to be excellent in its way. The simplest answer to why the Soviets did this was that their large border required a lot of aircraft to defend it. Soviet leadership also recognized that the US was likely to outbuild and out-innovate it in aircraft production. The Soviet aircraft industry struggles to develop a true all-weather fighter during the 1950s is illustrative of this. The Soviets, unlike the Western powers, remembered the lessons of the Great Patriotic War. Failing everything else, mass is generally a good strategy and hard to combat with silver bullets. Because making the MiG-17 used many of the same tools as the MiG-15, it was efficient to mass produce. As Vietnam experience would later prove, it was a pain to deal with, even in small numbers. Cheapness and simplicity also made it a useful instrument of power projection, as it could be donated to communism-curious countries around the world in exchange for fealty. It's therefore wrong in some ways to focus on the Fresco's tactical capabilities. By accident or by design, it was a strategic weapon, the usefulness of which lasted far beyond its functional obsolescence. But all of that said, it's still a spectacular sight when it takes to the air and shows its moves.